Hi there everyone, thank you for joining us today and welcome to this Timpson webinar. This is the 10th in our series. I'm David Sanders-Ellis, one of the researchers at the Rees Centre working on the Alex Timpson Attachment and Trauma in Programme in Schools. I'm just going to quickly take you through some of our housekeeping before handing over to my colleague Helen, who will introduce our speaker today and chair the Q&A.
Looking forward today to hearing our speaker, Andrew Brown. He joined our team to work on the Timpson programme in March last year. He's been focusing on the work for this literature review that he's going to present today, and he's helping to shape the analysis of the data that's been collected from schools in the Timpson programme. Andrew has a background as a teacher, a senior leader in a special school, and as a teacher trainer, particularly focused around inclusive education. Andrew's area of research interest is around the influence of young people's adoptive identity on educational experience and outcomes, and his research has included analysis of data from a range of sources, including the Wales Adoption Cohort Study and Understanding Society, and he's currently completing his PhD at Cardiff University. So I'm going to hand over to Andrew. Thank you so much for taking this session today.
That's great, Helen. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Welcome everybody. Thank you for coming today to hearing about our work we've been doing reviewing evidence for attachment trauma interventions in schools. I'm hoping you can all see the slides okay. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a running order, what I'm going to hopefully cover this afternoon for you. We're going to cover a little bit of the background and aims to do with attachment trauma in school, not too much because I'm fully aware that many of you will be very familiar with that, but it doesn't help to just to recap and set our minds straight for the forthcoming presentation. We're going to go over the aims of the review, what we hope to find out. We're going to talk a little bit about the systematic review process as well, about why we chose to do a systematic review and the ins and outs of those things. I won't dwell on the minutiae of that today because we'll be here till tea time otherwise. And then we're going to present the findings of our studies, so the interventions that we covered, and also other studies that were included in the review, and of course we'll draw that together at the end in some conclusions and some ideas for future directions in research too. So we'll get going. So our basic sort of logic module, if you like, or our premise is that the education potential of many vulnerable children is largely unfulfilled. And one of the possible contributing factors to that, of course, is that possibly that schools are not able to perhaps address the wider personal anxieties and insecurities that many children face, and then perhaps the way the school system is set up. Certainly, children who are vulnerable have been seen to have high rates of school exclusion, poor educational outcomes, and high rates of mental health issues in school as well. And there is also research fairly recently that's reported where teachers feel perhaps insufficiently prepared to support these pupils effectively beyond the knowledge from their own training and their teaching experiences. So some of the children's difficulties have been identified as linked to issues to do with attachment and the attachment process, trauma and emotional well-being, and certainly much recent psychological research has crystallised around these issues. So attachment is it's a useful lens so that we can view relationships and development, and of course it's the quality of the attachment relationship that impacts on later development. Now, most children will form secure attachments, but for some, that attachment process is disrupted through experiencing early adversity, witnessing traumatic events, and persistent and inadequate care, for example. Now, some children show great resilience and may well recover to a greater or lesser extent given the appropriate conditions, but for some, the difficulties are enduring and they're persistent. Recent neurological research has highlighted that traumatic events and the impact it has on continued levels of stress and how it affects the growing brain structure, and this might lead to difficulties in regulation of stress and emotions and understanding emotions and forming appropriate responses to them. And we'll get back to that in the discussion because that's an important point that's come out of this study. So children who experienced early adversity are vulnerable to the effects of that early adversity, and that's the term that we're using in the study today. That's how we've categorised our ideas of vulnerability, is that children who have experienced early sort of traumatic events. So school itself is founded on the teacher-pupil dyad. It's built on relationships, but it's also a potential site for educational and social stress for children, because it's a very demanding environment for children. We are asking children to react to new situations and also manage their emotions at the same times. And this becomes, of course, more challenging for those children who've experienced adversity or traumatic events, and they may have a disrupted attachment process. Now, there's an emerging train of thought that's been going for many years now that the difficulties might be alleviated by a greater understanding of attachment and trauma-informed theory and practice, and maybe interventions that are based in an awareness of attachment. And certainly there was a review in a set of guidelines in 2015 produced by NICE about children's an extensive document, but amongst the many recommendations, it recommended school is a key site for children for an intervention, because it provides a safe and nurturing environment, and also that staff should be trained in attachment awareness, and of course that they be actively involved in multi-agency support. But it's really the whole school staff should be trained in attachment awareness is one of the key outcomes from there. So our review aims, what did we set out to do? So we wanted to review the attachment trauma literature since the 2015 report to see what's out there, and see if that report has been a driver for change in any way. We chose to do a systematic review because it's a gold standard of literature reviewing. It's a comprehensive method of data gathering and synthesis. For those that are perhaps unfamiliar, it's sort of a literature review with bells on, if you like. It's quite a detailed and process, and it has several protocols, I guess, that you follow, that you report on as well. And it's really about accumulating evidence for attachment trauma interventions in school, and perhaps being able to provide some assessment of the weight of the evidence, you know. And I was reminded recently by a colleague who suggested it was like building a bridge across a swamp. I think this is a Karl Popper analogy. You know, we're not trying to sort of build the bridge itself, but we're just trying to strengthen the supports that hold up that bridge across the swamp. We're contributing a bit to the overall pictures of that. So it's really about assessing what the weight of evidence is, and what maybe counts as evidence, and where we can go from here, what other supports for that bridge need to be built. There have been some similar reviews in this space fairly recently. One particular to mention is by Herrenkohl and colleagues in mainly US focused, and they found strong evidence that whole school approaches that are based on attachment trauma theory provide positive change. However, their sample, if you like, was about individual and small group therapeutic interventions as opposed to whole school. But they did indicate there might be suggestive evidence for whole school approaches, particularly through a change of the school culture and a change of climate, and that it promotes the relationship aspect of the school environment. But they also, in doing so, they also acknowledge how schools are a very complex environment through which to research, and we certainly take that on board and hope to develop that. So what did we do, and how did we do it? And as I said, it's a detailed and methodical process, and I won't go through all the really fine details, but I'll just give you a summary of some of the important points. We used a framework for reporting and reviewing the data. It's called PRISMA, which, for those that are interested, it stands for the Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analysis. It's a fairly well-known and well-published set of steps through which to review literature and gather the data. So at the start, we devised a detailed protocol, if you like, and we registered that a group called Prospero, which is based at the University of York, and it really sets out our it's like the method, if you like. This is what we're aiming to do. So it's published and it's out there, and we can provide the link if you'd like to go and see the detailed protocol that we set out to do. And as I said, Helen said, I joined the team last March, first day of lockdown, actually, 23rd of March last year. And systematic reviews take a long time because there's a very detailed set of steps to go through, but we're at the ends now. We just finalising the report and hope to get that submitted to a journal very soon. So we identified our search terms. We registered the protocol and we identified our search terms, and we looked again to the NICE document for that. And I said that was a very detailed and complex document, and we selected search terms that were relevant to the aims of our review, which was of course to review attachment trauma interventions in school. We identified our electronic databases to search, 16 in all, and also included in that was grey literature databases, so those that weren't just journal articles and published. And we did some hand searching of content lists as well, and it was a virtual hand, as most things are these days. So we put all that into the mix, hit the go button, and we got lots and lots of articles back. And I'm just going to take you through how we then got to the final selection of articles that we included in this review. So our records left us with a large amount, over 20,000, and we had a few that we identified from other sources as well, and that might have been in index searching, etc. So put them all together, we got quite a few records. Now, fortunately, we put this into a software. We used EndNote. Other softwares are available for systematic reviewing, but we use this out of familiarity. Some of us have used it before. Unfortunately, EndNote is able to sift through and sort out some duplicates. So because journal articles sometimes are registered on more than one database. So once we removed over 16,000 about duplicates, we were left with about almost 4,500 records that might well meet the aims of our review. And then we entered the screening process. So through those 4,000 articles, it was actually Helen and I looked at the titles and occasionally the abstracts of those articles. Again, put them in a group to say, okay, these look like they might meet our aims. So these are the ones we're going to look at in more detail a bit later. And that left us with about 197 articles. So we removed quite a few there that weren't relevant at all, that may have just had an additional word in the title that was of interest. So with those 197 articles, we gathered the full text, and we set about with some inclusion criteria to review and select the studies that were finally for review. So once we'd gone through that selection process, we excluded 164, and our inclusion criteria there on the left, you can see we were interested in school-aged children, so 4 to 18 years old, and we had some discussion about whether kindergarten we wanted to go that young, but we decided on about 4 to 18 years old. That any intervention in the study was needed to be school-based as opposed to clinical. We were keen that they should involve a comparison group where possible, though we did weight that inclusion criteria slightly, and we didn't make it a game breaker, if you like. So if there wasn't a comparison group, we didn't exclude on that basis, but we certainly were looking for studies that made comparisons to other groups. This is a broad review, so we wanted to include both quantitative and qualitative studies, and we had a range of study designs that we included as well. We excluded studies that were case control or clinical accounts because they didn't really fit with the scope of our review. And that left us with 33 articles from where we started that we reviewed in detail. And a part of the systematic review process is about assessing each study for risk of bias, if you like, to do with publication bias, to do with selection bias, for example. And we used a published set of forms and criteria from the Joanna Briggs Institute in Australia. So we assessed each study for a risk of bias, and 2 of the team assessed each study, and then we did some moderation as well, just so that we weren't biased ourselves. And then we formed a data extraction, if you like, where we set about with some specific things we wanted to get out of each study to include in the synthesis of the data. So what did we find from those 33 studies? What did we find? Well, the first thing that we noticed, which was a little surprise to us and quite pleasing in some senses, was the geographical distribution of the studies. Previous reviews have focused mainly on US studies, but again, so most of the studies included in our review were from UK, and then a fair smattering from the US and Europe and elsewhere as well. So that was interesting, and that may reflect the growing interest in the UK of attachment and trauma awareness in schools. So with our final included studies, almost 2/3 of them were studies that looked at individual differential outcomes for vulnerable children, and 12 of the studies in a review were a specific attachment and trauma informed intervention. So there was a range of designs from assessing national registers, from secondary analysis to longitudinal studies. So the synthesis, what we did, indicated that there may well be some links between the 2 groups of studies. So the groups that were in the differential outcome group, they examined the complex and nuanced picture across multiple contexts and populations, and the interventions offered possible, relief or alleviation of that, and certainly they were crossover, as hopefully we'll see in a moment. Interestingly, most of the articles, studies in our review focused on the adolescent age range, 10 to 15 years old. 1 or 2 I think looked at primary, one was very early, maybe year 1, I guess you'd say. But there was some commonalities in the findings, in the outcomes. So from the administrative and data linkage studies, and these tended to be very large samples, certainly reflected poorer educational outcomes for children in and on the edge of care, as opposed to compared to children in the general population. Studies that looked at a secondary analysis of existing data, like the N-score database in the US, they highlighted vulnerability in terms of behavioural challenges and social relationships. And the other quantitative studies, that they used a range of design, highlighted interesting school engagement as an important factor. Now that can be often termed as school connectedness or school membership, but that came through as an important factor, and it was related with insecure attachment, for example, in some studies, difficulties in school, improved attainment or increased externalizing behaviour, but it also acted as a protective factor. So that feeling of belonging to school was seen as quite key. And our qualitative studies that we included also focused on the centrality of peer relationship in the school, and how how impactful it is to have positive relationships in the school, and also through teachers' consideration of children's needs through their pedagogy, through their curriculum and the subjects and how they wish to teach it. The interventions, of course, supported this, and that despite significant challenges faced by vulnerable children and young people, their impact may be alleviated by a school-wide approach based on a greater understanding and awareness of how unmet attachment needs and traumatic events may affect engagement with learning and school. So the outcomes from the interventions were much largely positive. It's a really rich set of data and varied, that showed across different settings and slightly different populations that a school-wide approach based on attachment and trauma has positive outcomes. But there are some caveats to that, of course, and I will get to those later. Now, it's interesting to also think about, well, what constitutes an intervention program based on attachment and trauma? Now, we talked about some things in the introduction, and it would seem logical that those things to do with attachment and to do with the neurological side, whether they existed in the interventions that we found. And I think if you forgive the rather crude analysis of the intervention program content, but it just gives us an idea or an outline. So what we did, we looked at the where the interventions were reported. They reported what the program contained. We put those into a simple word count chart and came up with this Wordle here. But you can see, you know, certainly the things that we talked about in the introduction there. And most of the intervention studies trained in things with emotion coaching and emotion regulation. And the next largest group, if you like, looks at trained staff in neuroscience and impact of trauma on developing brain. Yes, attachment theory was there, but also understanding of behaviour, but explanations of behaviour and how and response to it. And a few studies, intervention studies, looked at the nurturing and relational approaches to training. What was interesting, and this may well be something to do with constraints from the journal published and the word count and reporting of it was the detail of the intervention program content wasn't there, and I think that was just to do with the amount of space to go into that detail in the publications. But we certainly had the topics, and they certainly are comparable to what we were expecting. There were some intervention programs, certainly by name. There was the KITS one from the US, which is, I think, was Kids in Transition to School. I think that was Graham in 2018. There was the TYPE model, again, that was US, which is trauma-informed positive education. And there were several in the UK that were under the banner of attachment-aware schools. Now, these were packages from local authorities that were given to schools in a local authority, and they may have differences between, it wasn't a branding, if you like, but there were differences between local authorities, essentially the same and coming from the same areas, but there were slight variations. And other interventions to do with emotion coaching particularly, and the one or two that were left were bespoke interventions that were research led, if you like, and often based in just one educational setting. What we found with the interventions themselves, and all of the 33 studies included, that we could conceptualize them into four main areas. When we synthesize the information from, you know, what is important in these interventions, and what do they positive outcomes do they report. And I hope you'll forgive the rather 80s color scheme, but I was getting a bit carried away with the highlighters I was using, and anyway, there you go. So we got four domains there. So you looked at intrapersonal factors, so that's things like self-esteem and stress, certainly relationships. They looked at staff development as well, and some school level factors. But domains weren't mutually exclusive between the studies. So some of the studies looked at factors in maybe 2 or 3 of those areas, or were able to report on it. I'm just going to give you a quick summary now, because I think that leads to our inclusions rather nicely. So for our intrapersonal factors, again, it's to do with self-esteem, to do with emotion regulation, and that was the main areas. It's to do with pupils' understanding and teachers' understanding of emotion regulation, and certainly emotion coaching was involved in that, leading to improved communication and result, and in some cases led to a reduction of what's called emotion dismissing by adults, where the adults in the school could help the children understand their emotions that they were struggling to understand themselves. So the inter aspect of it was about sort of relationships and interactions. Now, of course, in school there's a tetrad, if you like, of possible interactions between pupils, and peers and teachers and parents. Interestingly, the interventions in our study mainly focused on the pupil to teacher or the pupil to pupil interaction. But there are other possible combinations of interactions, and that may well form basis of some future research. But we found that staff place themselves as almost a conduit through which more positive relationships are established. They were able to coach or help the children, if you like, build those positive interactions. And you know, positive interactions form the building blocks of trust and relationships, and staff saw themselves as being able to break the cycle of negativity, where improvements in one relationship dyad could lead to improvements in others too. One of the main areas that came through from the interventions was this that could be termed as staff development, if you like, where changes in staff knowledge and understanding, as well as their pedagogy and practice, impacted on positive outcomes. And it was about opportunity for reflection. It was seen that the training itself and the idea to take stock, if you like, and to hear from more knowledgeable others about attachment and trauma and explanations of behaviour allowed teachers to reflect and discuss issues related to their own understanding of attachment and trauma, and it acted as a catalyst for change in their approaches to supporting pupils of histories of early adversity. Another important factor we found in terms of staff development was the training enabled the translation of theory and research into practice. So the staff were given a sort of form of words, if you like, and scripts and skills and strategies that they could directly apply in the moment. And I think that's what many teachers seem to report, was that it's okay knowing this, but what do I do when I'm in the moment? What do I say? I don't want to, you know, make the situation worse, or I want to, you know. So it's about sort of being able to talk that through and having just a form of words or sentence stems, if you like, with which to build on their interactions. Certainly in intervention studies, we found school staff consistently viewed their trainings as having a positive impact on their understanding, but also on the practice. But interestingly, they were able to recognise that in their colleagues as well, and it wasn't just limited to teaching staff, but in other staff around the school. And as a final, but certainly no less important aspect across the intervention studies that we found, was that support from senior leadership was seen as key for the success of the attachment intervention, where there was positive leadership from the leadership teams in the school. That was found to have to help those positive outcomes. Now, school-based or school-level outcomes were really, in terms of two different aspects, that to do with school engagement, which we mentioned before, that came about from change in the school environment, but also studies looked at or attempted to look at quantifiable outcomes such as attainment and exclusion rates and rates of attendance. But that's problematic to ascertain, and we'll try and get to that in as to why that is in a moment. It's certainly difficult to gather that data and research. But changes in the school environment, quite a few studies talked of the creation of a safe place or a breakout room. I think one study in the US, it was called the Monarch Room, or, you know, where pupils that were maybe in crisis or feeling themselves into crisis in times of increased anxiety or distress could go, and sometimes it was staffed by specially trained staff, but certainly the benefits of having that breakout room or that safe place were enhanced. That the studies in our review showed that if the pupils are involved in the design and the naming of the area, and that the pupil's choice to use it is regarded as a positive, as opposed to having a punitive purpose and meaning. Many of the studies talked about school climate, how that following the intervention, that there's a more nurturing and calmer school environment, and this was seen to lead quite directly to some positive outcomes overall. As I mentioned a minute ago about the quantifiable outcomes, some interventions sought to assess whether improvements in attainment and attendance and exclusion rates. Now, it's very difficult to gather that data, in the sense that it's difficult to ascertain from the quantitative school level data. So often data collection occurs at different time points to the end of the intervention. There's been recent changes in national data collection and assessment, but also there are some confounding variables as well that, we weren't quite sure what other programs in the school were going on at the time that may have contributed to that. But overall, the data it's encouraging, but it's not wholly conclusive, and there's certainly room for development in that space. So we're going to come towards the end. What we conclude from our review, certainly the key message is that it confirms that idea that vulnerable children face significant challenges in education in a variety of areas, including psychological and emotional and social and school environment. And that there is rich evidence that that these challenges may be alleviated in some way by whole school interventions that are grounded in attachment and trauma awareness, and that's really one of the other key messages, this idea of the whole school, not just teaching staff but also ancillary staff and other staff around the school that are able to it's all about the interactions they have with children in the school, and the more aware and the positive they are, that leads again to greater outcomes. But there are some, obviously some limitations with this review process. For example, there might be some other interventions out there that weren't included in the review because they've not yet been evaluated or published. And I know there's certainly one in Birmingham, there's one in Islington, that we weren't able to review the literature because maybe it's not there or didn't quite fit our inclusion criteria. And the details of the intervention programme, they weren't fully elucidated in all of the studies, so we didn't have great details of what the training consisted of, but also whether that training was evaluated and monitored and how that affected it. But it's likely that the training acted as a catalyst for discussion, anyway. And of course, schools are very complex learning organisations, and this impacts on the ability to absorb and synthesise and employ new knowledge and skills. In essence, there's so much going on in schools, it's difficult to sort of isolate out what those things were. But as I said, key messages, it's about the whole school approach to the interventions. It's understanding what the training content is. It's about providing an ongoing conversation within the school amongst staff, and the key message is about the importance of school leadership in supporting that the interventions. So ideas for future research. I think the evidence is it's rich and it's emerging and it's promising. I think many of the studies that were interventions were of the smaller end of the scale, if you like, and it's maybe down to sort of, resources and such like. So some large-scale intervention evaluation, possibility to expand the age range, and I know that some of the studies did look at sort of primary levels as well, but more in a sense, and maybe to explore other dyadic interactions within the school. As I said, most of the studies looked at the pupil-teacher or the peer-to-peer relationship, but also it's about parents and those interactions as well, and maybe to explore the role of associated professionals that are involved with the children as well, how they might well support children who are vulnerable to the impact of early adversity. So I think we're there. I think that's I think the whole school approach. One thing I just noticed I will add was that it didn't appear to. Some schools chose to do an en masse approach, if you like, where they did a whole school inset day, and others opted for a cascade model, and that didn't appear to have any difference in the outcomes. But they were both sort of both positive, but each of those has positive aspects to it. But if I'm happy to take comments and questions from anyone now. Also, there's my email address. If things occur to anybody after the webinar, then please do send me an email, and I'll hopefully be able to clarify that. But we're hoping to submit this paper in the next couple of weeks to a journal, so you'll be able to read it in great detail when it comes out. I'm sure we'll let you know about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Andrew. That was great. So we're seeing a few questions coming through. I'm going to kick off with some that we've that I've been thinking about. So just a bit of a general one. Why would we do a literature review? Why is that something that's useful to actually do?
Well, it sets where we are in the current landscape, really, and this research, it emerges all the time. It develops and it follows different trends, and it's important to update. Certainly since the 2015 NICE review, but it's important to see what the landscape is, what is out there that works. What sort of research questions are people following? And there was certainly a trend in the research for the non-intervention studies, for example, that we found in our review. There were certain commonalities about the areas that that they were looking into, and again, it was about those individual aspects and those sort of relational, emotional aspects of research as well. So it provides us with and the systematic review provides us with a comprehensive go at that. We're fairly confident we included all of the studies that were possible to include, because we had such a wide search strategy, if you like. So yeah, that's why.
Thank you. So with that, I'm thinking then, obviously with the systematic review, wide search strategies, we get lots of those papers. How do you compare studies that analyse huge data sets and big quantitative studies with those that have used interviews with schools? How can you compare those two different types?
Well, it's certainly difficult. What we chose to do was, or what we ended up doing, because of the studies that we got in, was what was called a narrative synthesis. So it was about storytelling. It was about painting a picture and telling a story about the researchers out there. Now, you can do something called a meta-analysis, whereas if you've got similarities between the measures that are used, and you can do some sort of quantitative analysis of a review of the reviews, if you like, and to give you some commonality about outcomes there. But really, you're able to do it through what's called a narrative synthesis, and we, in our review in particular, we grouped the studies into different areas. So we had the studies that looked at an intervention, and we had the studies that looked at the sort of more differential outcomes. And trying to put those together was fairly tricky. And it's also about understanding the nuances of the research as well. So studies that look at and link large administrative databases will have a huge sample size, and studies that look at secondary analysis will have a fairly large sample size. But of course, they're constrained by the questions that are set in that original survey, whereas a more bespoke research maybe have smaller sample size, but it's more focused and more detailed. So it's great to get the wide variety, so we can see a good overview of the research that's out there.
Brilliant, thank you for that. So one of the other questions that we've been thinking about is, what do we know about non-English speaking parts of the world in this area? What that we might not necessarily picked up in this review.
Well, exactly, and we wouldn't have done, in fact, because some of our inclusion criteria was we relied on articles that were written in English, and there may well be studies out there in different countries that are not written in English that will be able to comment, and we just have to take that as a limitation of the review. It's to be able to do a global review would be great, but I think it might depend on resources and such like. So yeah, then they may well be out there. I know that there's some work done in Chile to do with adopted children and outcomes in schools, but again, it's having the resources for translation, etc. But yeah, it's one of the limitations you have to sort of bear in mind when you're interpreting the evidence.
Yeah, Thank you for that. So one of the questions from our audience, is there a central platform where we can access types of interventions being used or types of staff training that can support rolling out across a whole school? Is there a central resource?
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. As far as I know, I haven't come across one. Certainly there are attachment and trauma programs that are established and that have been used, but I'm not aware of a central platform, if you like, where information can be gleaned, and maybe that's to do with how they're evaluated or not. I don't know, but that would certainly be a useful place to start. But I think it would be for example, in this country, approaching the local authority will be an educational psychology service will probably be a good place to start. Maybe contact us at the Rees Centre. We might have some information, but we're not tied to any particular sort of intervention program. So it's an interesting point. For schools that are wanting to engage with this and to do this, where do they go? But certainly the local authority would be a good place to start.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a good answer. It's a difficult question, isn't it? But it's a good idea.
I'm gonna go do one now.
Yes, make one.
Sounds a good idea. I should make one now.
So we've got a question about, I suppose, the literature review process. So you just presented what the inclusion criteria were. Were there any exclusion criteria, or how did you go about doing the actual exclusion?
Yes, so we did have some exclusion criteria. For example, we excluded studies that were case studies, so individual case studies. We excluded studies that looked at a clinical aspect, or where the site of the intervention was out of the school base. And these are decisions that come down in the systematic review design. We sit around and we discuss what the aims of the review are and how best to include studies that will be related. And really, there are a great many clinical case study articles out there, but that doesn't really fall within the scope, because we were primarily interested in the school as a base for an intervention, and particularly the whole school. So even interventions that may have been therapeutic that were for one or two children in the school, like the Heracol review, that's a really good comprehensive review, but it didn't sort of fit in with our idea of, well, we want to look at training the whole school in attachment awareness and the outcomes, and using the school as a site for intervention. So they may so again, studies had to be in English, because that's the resources of the review team. So really they were for the selection process. We devised a form, if you like, where we had, as we looked through each study, that we had our inclusion sort of criteria. So and we sort of highlighted them and ticked them off, if you like, and when you got to the end of the form, it looked like all the ones on the inclusion side, so it was then in. But again, we did excuse me, it's quite a rigorous moderation process as well, because the studies, the 197 that were selected, that were reviewed and assessed for inclusion, were done independently by two researchers, or two or three researchers. So each study was done twice independently. We then put those results together, and when there are any discrepancies, we arm wrestled over it, and so we discussed it and saw, an agreement was reached through discussion. But I think our rate was pretty high. I think it's in the 80s. It's in the paper when it comes out. Our initial agreement was about 80% anyway. So we were, and that's about training of the team and knowing where we're all coming from. So we're looking to include the same sorts of studies. So but it's part of the the design of the review, I guess.
Yeah, Great. So sticking sort of with the review and what you've just presented, I've got a question about just expand a little bit on the difference between, or maybe what you mean by differential outcomes as opposed to an intervention.
Sure. So really the intervention was where there was a specific point of training for usually the whole school staff that was based in attachment and trauma awareness, where the staff could then go and apply those ideas and understanding to their everyday situation. Other studies that came up that were also that met our inclusion criteria weren't based on an intervention as such, but they were more perhaps, I guess, psychological research into aspects that are related to attachment and trauma. So they might have certainly included a vulnerable population, usually children in care or children on the edge of care, or children who have been adopted, and it's so it was, and they might have looked at specific things to do with attachment quality or insecurity, or they might have looked at some kind of relational aspect of it. But of course, our inclusion criteria were to do with, it had to be in school, so it wasn't just almost like a random sampling of young people that they were going to assess about their attachment and quality. There had to be a school aspect to it. So, or certainly that would be directly linked to learning. And certainly the 20 odd studies that were looked at the differential outcomes focused on things like sort of attachment, security, and relationships, and how that might impact their everyday learning. So they seem to be two distinct groups. We might have thought, well, perhaps we've got two reviews here, but there were some links between them in the sense that the interventions were based on those things, that not directly because of each study, but on the things that might be classed as differential outcomes.
Thank you for that. So one of the kind of points and questions that's come through is about whether we revisit what we fundamentally believe the purpose of education to be. So is the elephant in the room the context in which schools are being asked to operate? How research informed has government and department policy been in developing education and provision? Do we need to revisit?
That could be a whole other webinar, which would be an absolutely great one. Maybe there is a reframing of what we understand success at school to be, and maybe there is a reframing of what we think. Certainly, post-COVID, where more and more children have been affected by the pandemic. Their anxiety will have increased, their confidence, and example, and it's and for those children that were already vulnerable to those effects, will have been impacted by the pandemic greatly as well. So the attachment trauma awareness is going to support all pupils in the school, even those that aren't necessarily classed as vulnerable. It's going to support them in their relationship, so it's going to help there. And it's a very wide question that how much does research inform policy and practice? It absolutely should. Whether it absolutely does is a wider debate. But I think with so programs like the Alex Simpson Trauma Informed Program in schools and the review that we've done here, there's a strengthening of that evidence. The weight of the evidence is growing to say that it's more to do. There is more in the relational aspects and the emotional aspects of children. But I think perhaps the sort of the debate is central, because it's not going to be a quick fix. This isn't a magic wand to suddenly improve your GCSE or your Progress 8 scores or your SATs at year 6 results in 1 year. But what it's going to do, it's going to engage children more fully in school. It's going to engage children that are maybe marginalized, engage them into school and into learning. And yes, philosophically, is it about qualifications at the end, or is it about having a positive educational experience and education? Because that idea of a school community is much more than yes, certainly qualifications and are important. However, so is well-being and mental health and relationships. So I think you're absolutely right. It should certainly inform policy and practice. How much it does, or how much it does as we'd like it to, I think that's an open question. Yeah, well, we can have another webinar on that. That would be a good debate.
We've got a question asking about whether in the studies that we looked at, whether there was any correlation identified between like a behaviour and discipline, a policy and approaches, and then the attachment provision identified as successful.
I think what's been asked is that, was there any correlation between the sort of a behaviour policy that is informed by attachment awareness into outcomes? From memory, there wasn't anything specific, but certainly the idea moving away from that very behaviourist sticker charts and charts on the wall to show who's got the most stickers for doing something that's classed as good or whatever. There may be suggesting a move away from that, from the idea of a more restorative, a more relational approach to to behaviour, and certainly what was found is that where teachers understood the message behind children's behaviour more, they gained confidence in being able to, where there were instances of challenging behaviour, and sometimes it's through the use of those scripts and things to say it's about recognising emotions. I wonder if you're feeling angry about what's just happened, for example. Providing the tools for communication, if you like, between in those relationships, and removing the idea of blame, and understanding that behaviour as communication, and that in turn will then it reduces the instances of, and I know one study looked at something called, I think, call outs, where children were exited from the classroom, or another teacher was brought in to help with a situation. They found some indication that certainly, recognition of emotion and emotion regulation would help with that. But again, as I said, making that link directly to those quantifiable outcomes is very difficult to do in such a short space of time. But certainly, there's some signal against some noise, and I think what we've got to do is really focus on that signal and try and amplify that signal, and to explore what's going on more fully.
Thank you. So I think we've got time for this last question before we wrap up. Why did we decide not to look at the under 4 age group? And do we have any future plans to look at this age group? And they sort of shared a comment to say that schools are becoming trauma informed, but PVI under 5's provision is much less well informed. Yeah.
Again, it was. Part of it was to do with the scope of our review and our research. Part of it is to do really from a psychological point of view, maybe, of trying to isolate what is sort of regular standard development in very young children and attachment related behaviours and issues to do with the disrupted attachment. It's very difficult, I think, to distinguish for certainty between the two, and we were interested in the school-basedness of it. One of the studies that we included, the KITS intervention from America, which is the Kids in Transition to School, looked at the first year of kindergarten and how their program was and again, this is one of the difficulties, but it was such a wide-ranging program, but it included some attachment and trauma-informed aspects of it, which is why it met the criteria. But they found it reduced children's stress over the school day for the first few weeks after starting school. So, certainly there is value there, absolutely. Maybe that's an aspect of future research that we could we could look into. I mean, it would be fascinating to find out, but really it was to do with the scope of the review and making it manageable in the time, but certainly not to say that it doesn't happen there or something, but it would be something to explore in the future for certain.
Thank you. I think in terms of time, we will leave it there. Thank you so much, Andrew, for presenting all that hard work that you spent, you know, sort of the last year and a bit, you know, leading and focusing on. And it's, you know, it's been great to be part of and be involved in, you know, learning about and reading that literature. So just to wrap up, we have a few extra comments where people have reminded us about the Attachment Research Community website. That is a resource that's available. You know, it has material to download from it, videos to look at, so things you can use, you know, in schools or you know, just as a resource there, and encouragement to get in touch with your local authority. Your virtual school is often quite open to discussing support in this area for any schools or even parents and carers that just want to ask those questions and get in touch. So you know, use the local resources that's available, and as I said, there's a link been put in the chat to the Attachment Research Community. Thank you everyone for joining us, all 55 of you. Thank you for engaging and
well done.
You know, sending comments.
Thank you very much.
Have a good rest of the evening, everyone. Please do check out the recording, go to the YouTube channel and check out the other webinars if you're interested. But from all of us, thank you very much and have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.